Imagine being one of the most powerful rulers on earth, living in one of the most breathtaking palaces ever built, surrounded by gold, mirrors, silk, and luxury. Now imagine that same palace smelling so awful some visitors nearly fainted. And imagine its king, Louis XIV, bathing so rarely that historians can count his known baths on one hand. This is the story of the Sun King, and the extremely weird, often disgusting hygiene habits of 17th century France. Today we're diving deep, very deep, into why Louis XIV barely bathed, why Versailles smelled like a never-ending nightmare, and how a whole nation convinced itself that water was dangerous. But before you judge the past too fast, ask yourself this. If everyone around you smelled like that, would you even notice? Let's find out. Louis XIV, born in 1638, eventually came to rule France for 72 years, a reign so long and so transformational that the phrase the Sun King still evokes images of absolute monarchy, enormous centralized power, elaborate court ritual, and the physical expression of authority in architecture and fashion. He wasn't just a king who ruled. He performed kingship as theatre every day. The palace at Versailles was his stage, and everyone in his orbit had a part to play. To appreciate the strangeness of his hygiene, you have to picture the man and his world. Louis was obsessed with control and image. He staged his mornings, the lever where courtiers watched him wake and prepare, and he controlled who saw him, when, and how. Everything about his life was curated to project power: the clothes, the rituals, the carefully orchestrated public appearances. But for all that attention to surface and spectacle, physical cleanliness as we understand it today was not a priority. Contemporary travellers, diplomats, and courtiers reported on his habits with a mix of awe and bewilderment. They described powdered wigs so thick they looked like white helmets, layered costumes that would seem absurdly impractical today, and rooms hung with sumptuous textiles that masked smells but trapped dirt. Standards of clean were not based on water and soap but on linen changes and scent. If your clothes looked fresh and smelled of musk or rose, you were considered presentable. Louis's routine combined ritual with avoidance. He embraced cosmetics and perfumed powders, but avoided prolonged contact with water. His servants changed his linen often, and he indulged in face washes and hand washing that were theatrical as much as hygienic. In many ways, Louis epitomized the paradox of his era: outward splendor masking underlying filth. When stories of his infrequent baths reached foreign courts, they were told with a mixture of moralizing satire and genuine wonder. To some contemporaries, the king's habits were evidence of decadence. To others, they were merely adherence to medical wisdom of the time. Understanding him requires understanding those medical beliefs, which we'll get to. But first, let's pause and frame the central question. Was Louis XIV unusually dirty, or simply a man of his era with resources to hide it better than most? If you're into weird history and the parts of the past your teachers skipped, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss more episodes like this. And before we get back to the stench of Versailles, comment below, would you have survived life at Versailles? Why or why not? Be honest. I want to see how many of you are tough enough to say yes. However, this is where the story stops being a set of gross anecdotes and starts to reveal a world shaped by fear, medical theory, religion, and social custom. The refusal to bathe in early modern France wasn't simply slovenliness. It was rooted in the medical consensus of the age. For centuries, medical theory in Europe was dominated by humouralism, the idea that health depended on a balance of four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Maintaining the balance meant managing temperature, moisture, diet, and exposure. Bathing, especially in hot water, was thought to disrupt that precarious balance. Doctors warned that immersion in warm water opened the pores and let in malignant humours or miasmas, what passed for disease particles. Wet skin meant vulnerable skin. There were repeated pamphlets and medical treatises arguing that bathing could cause chills, fevers, and even death. These were not fringe opinions. They were the received wisdom of reputable physicians. When a king's personal physician warned against bathing, that advice carried weight, not just for the monarch, but across the court and into the whole elite culture. Layered on top of medical fear was social memory. Medieval and early Renaissance bathhouses had sometimes been hotspots for contagious disease and sexual promiscuity. Stories of plague spreading through communal baths lingered. After waves of plague, general distrust of public bathing spaces hardened into cultural practice. Where bathing had been a civic routine in Roman times, by the 17th century, Europe's elite viewed it with suspicion and moral distaste. So what replaced bathing? People relied on dry cleaning, frequent changes of linen garments, since shirts were believed to absorb sweat and oils and hence clean the skin. Perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and powders were used to cover odour. Light washes of the face and hands with scented cloths were ritualised. Full immersion was rare and clinically framed as a health risk to be endured only when absolutely necessary. The wealthy used colognes and scented waters to fumigate rooms. Smoke and incense were used ceremonially in churches and aristocratic residences to clean the air. This fear-based hygiene model created a strange paradox. Those with resources could appear cleaner by virtue of better-smelling clothes, even if their bodies were not washed. The social stakes were high. Smelling like the wrong thing could mark you as lower status or immoral. So the elite adapted, investing in perfumery and wardrobe to project cleanliness without water. Historians now understand that many of these medical beliefs were wrong, but in their time they were authoritative. That's the core of why so many nobles, including Louis XIV, avoided baths. It wasn't simply personal oddity, it was the product of an entire medical and cultural ecosystem. Versailles was not built for sanitation. It was built to impress. The palace's architecture, gardens, hallways and salons were designed for ceremony, display, and the projection of authority, not for the management of human waste and thousands of bodies. When Louis moved the court from Paris to the countryside, he transported the entire social machine. Nobles, clerks, cooks, stable hands and their attendants. Versailles swelled into a micro-city with a population that the plumbing of the age simply could not handle. A faithful mental image, long corridors lined with tapestries that trapped odours and dust, narrow staircases where courtiers rubbed shoulders, cramped servants' quarters where washing facilities were minimal, and gardens where the court sometimes relieved itself in the open. Chamber pots were ubiquitous, but emptying them was laborious and messy. Refuse was a constant problem. The palace's water supply was engineered for fountains and formal gardens more than for sanitation. Sewage systems were primitive. Cesspits collected waste in the dark and unreliable underbellies of glorious architecture. Diplomats and visitors recorded their reactions with unembellished disgust. One wrote that walking the palace felt like moving through a theatre of perfume masking a multitude of darker things. Others described the shock of seeing top courtiers in powdered wigs approach a throne room that smelled heavily of urine and unwashed bodies. The servants tasked with maintenance were heroic in their efforts, but overwhelmed. Scented candles, incense racks, and burning pitch became the frontline defences, temporary patches masking persistent problems. The social choreography around hygiene created awkward rituals. Nobles arranged their presence to avoid the worst-smelling areas. Maids and pages worked in frantic rotations to change bedding and launder shirts, and members of the court learned to read social cues, where to stand, when to turn their face, how to hold a handkerchief. Personal space was small, and privacy was rarer still. Versailles' public rituals, meals, balls, the king's lever and coucher, put bodies in close proximity for long stretches, compounding the problem. Because of this, smell became political. To be known as a person with poor scent could be ruinous to reputation and marriage prospects. Conversely, being perceived as well-scented was a social asset. Perfume merchants thrived. Laundresses and linen changers were indispensable. The palace's filth was not a sign of neglect so much as a structural consequence of elite performance culture. It's a grim reminder that beauty and squalor often grow in the same place when resources are diverted to spectacle rather than to basic infrastructure. Now let's focus on the king himself and separate sensational claim from archival reality. Louis XIV's grooming rituals were elaborate and highly performative. He engaged in a kind of selective cleanliness. Certain parts of the body received careful attention, while full immersion in water was rare. The Sun King prized appearances and controlled the optics of his daily life. The toilette, his public dressing ritual, was a spectacle combining attendants, perfumed waters, and cosmetics designed to keep him looking regal. Practical routine. Louis would have his chamberlain and pages assist him in a staged morning ritual. His attendants would wash his face and hands with scented cloths, carefully, step by step, as if preparing a portrait. Fresh linen was essential. Shirts were changed often because fabric was understood to absorb sweat and thereby clean the body. He wore wigs and powdered his hair, a practice that both hid natural hair oils and created a uniform look that hinted at cleanliness. Cosmetics were not merely decorative. White lead-based face paints and powders made skin appear flawless. Rouge painted vitality into cheeks. But these materials were toxic and abrasive, leading to skin problems that could worsen over time. Makeup hid dirt as much as it improved appearance. His dental health was disastrous, an example of the limits of elite care. Louis suffered from rotting teeth and painful extractions. Dentists sometimes operated crudely, with forceps and no anesthesia, causing long-term damage. One anecdote recounts a day where he endured multiple extractions that left him unable to chew properly. Bad breath was likely common in such conditions, another impetus for perfuming the mouth and using scented handkerchiefs. Clothing was the king's secondary skin. He invested in expensive linen and silk that he changed frequently. Arguably, the investment in clothes was a hygiene strategy. Swap out the absorbent fabric and you reduce direct contact with sweat and grime. He also required certain standards of scent in his immediate entourage. Courtiers were expected to arrive perfumed and well-dressed. This created an illusion of cleanliness, an olfactory theatre that suggested sanitation even when water was absent. So yes, Louis XIV's actual bodily washing was infrequent by modern standards, but he compensated with ritualized washing of visible parts, cosmetic maintenance, clothing changes, and heavy perfuming. This combination helped him maintain the regal image he so carefully curated. Perfume was the social technology that solved the smell problem without challenging the medical and social taboos around water. Think of perfume not as luxury, but as infrastructure. It masked odours, defined social rank, and created an economy around scent. The perfume trade boomed in 17th century France. New distillation techniques, the import of exotic spices and oils, and the artisanal skills of perfumers created a market that reached every layer of elite life. Perfume was applied to almost everything. Clothing was dusted with scented powders. Gloves, a constant accessory, were perfumed to cover sweat. Furniture, drapery, and even mattresses were treated. Aristocrats kept little sachets and pomanders, small aromatic balls, to tuck into pockets and hems. Public spaces and churches were perfumed with incense, and hotels and salons used aroma as an indicator of gentility. Perfume became an emblem of refinement because it signaled you had both the taste and the money to participate in a world where water-based cleanliness was suspect. For the wealthy, it was cheaper, easier, and socially safer to buy and be seen with fine scents than to advocate for structural changes like better sewage. The cultural preference for scent over soap was economically self-reinforcing. More demand for perfumes meant more production, which made scent more central to social life. And there was a broader cultural dimension. Scent became symbolic. It signalled not just the absence of odour, but the presence of refinement, access, and power. The Sun King's court set the standard. You did not merely wash, you curated your presence. Perfume merchants became prestigious suppliers. Being the artisan who kept Versailles smelling acceptable could make you wealthy and influential. This obsession also left a legacy. France's enduring reputation as a perfume capital grew directly from these centuries of high demand. The irony is sharp. A culture that avoided water came to be globally famous for making the best artificial scents to replace it. We need to finish by untangling myth from fact. The punchy headline, "Louis XIV never bathed," is great clickbait, but the truth is subtler. Yes, he bathed rarely. Yes, he used perfumed rituals and cosmetic applications obsessively, but never is hyperbole. There were moments, medical necessities, ceremonial needs, or perhaps times of extreme discomfort, when bathing did occur. Those events were so rare they drew notice and commentary. The bigger historical truth is structural. The hygiene practices of Louis XIV's court were the product of interconnected forces: medical theory, infrastructure, social performance, economics, and politics. Men and women of his class evolved rituals that substituted scent and clothing changes for water-based washing. This worked as a system because everyone in the elite shared the same assumptions. When a whole social class believes a certain medical truth, ritual and economy follow. That brings us to perspective. It's easy and satisfying to mock the past from the vantage of modern soap and plumbing. But historical empathy asks us to see how reasonable those practices look to contemporaries. If you live in a world where your doctor warns you against hot water and your infrastructure can't handle mass bathing, and public baths are associated with disease, then perfuming and linen changing come to make sense. Finally, the human note. Louis XIV is not just a curiosity, he's a study in contrasts. A man who demanded perfection in image yet accepted squalor in the spaces behind that image. He centralized power, redefined monarchy, and left physical traces, both beautiful and repulsive. His life reminds us that power often depends on surface and spectacle, and that spectacle can hide ugly realities. Thanks for watching, and if you think your day is rough, remember, at least your home probably doesn't smell like 3,000 unwashed nobles.